The Galactic Council thought Earth had gone quiet. No protests. No fleets. No desperate pleas. Then every screen in the chamber went dark. One transmission replaced them all. A human voice calm. Steady. Final. You were warned. There was no threat. No negotiation. Because by the time this message was received, Earth had already acted. The prophecy they ignored, Commander Elizabeth Chen, stood at the center of the Grand Assembly Hall. A structure so vast it had once held 10,000 representatives from across the galaxy. Now the chamber felt hollow. Empty seats stretched into shadows where proud civilizations had once debated the fate of worlds. Today, only 400 beings remained, scattered across the lower tiers like survivors. Clinging to wreckage after a storm, Elizabeth activated the holographic transmitter. Her image would be broadcast across every remaining frequency, reaching every ship, every colony, every desperate soul still alive in the shrinking bubble of protected space. She wore the dark blue uniform of Earth's Defense Command, and on her chest, 7 silver stars represented the fallen worlds humanity had tried to save. Her voice echoed through the chamber as she began to speak. This is Commander Elizabeth Jean of Earth, broadcasting on all channels. What I am about to tell you is the final accounting, the complete record of how we arrived at this moment. Some of you already know parts of this story. Others have chosen to forget. But today, everyone will hear the truth. The hologram shifted, showing Earth as it had appeared 65 years earlier. A blue and green jewel, still young by galactic standards, orbiting an unremarkable yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy. Humanity had discovered faster than light travel only 30 years before making contact with the Galactic Assembly. They had been so excited, so eager to meet the ancient civilizations that had been traveling the stars for millions of years. Elizabeth continued her narration. When humanity first came to this assembly, we were nothing in your eyes. We lived barely a century, while some of you counted your ages in thousands of years. Our ships were slow and clumsy. Our weapons were primitive. Our understanding of the universe was limited. You tolerated us because your laws required it, but you never respected us. We were children at the table of giants, and you never let us forget it. The hologram changed again, showing a human research station orbiting a distant star. It was a small facility, built from salvaged materials and human determination. Inside that station, Dr. Marcus Webb had been conducting routine observations of subspace phenomena when he noticed something that would change everything. Marcus was a quantum physicist, one of Earth's brightest minds. He had been studying the patterns of subspace energy, mapping the invisible currents that allowed faster than light travel. But over 6 months of observation, he detected anomalies that made no sense according to any known physics. There were gaps in the quantum field, spaces where energy simply ceased to exist. At first, he thought his equipment was malfunctioning. He calibrated and recalibrated, but the readings remained consistent. The gaps were moving. Slowly, impossibly slowly by galactic standards, but they were definitely moving inward from the galactic rim. Marcus spent another year gathering data before he understood what he was seeing. The gaps were not natural phenomena. They were being created by something that consumed energy itself, something that fed on the fundamental forces of the universe. Elizabeth's grandmother, Ambassador Sarah Chen, had been the one to present Marcus's findings to the Galactic Assembly. The hologram showed the younger Sarah standing at this very podium, her voice steady despite the hostile attention focused upon her. She had brought charts, data recordings, mathematical models, everything humanity had discovered about the approaching threat. The Assembly's response had been swift and brutal. The Vorath representative, High Chancellor Torvin, had been the first to speak. The Vorath were an ancient species who had ruled vast territories for 3 million years. Their empire was built on advanced technology and absolute certainty in their own superiority. Torvin's 4 eyes had regarded Sarah with something between amusement and contempt. Your instruments are faulty. He had declared, the Vorath have surveyed this galaxy for longer than your species has existed. We have mapped every anomaly, every phenomenon. There is nothing approaching from the galactic rim except Empty space and dying stars, the crystalline collective had agreed. They were beings of living crystal, ancient beyond measure, who processed information through quantum entanglement. If something was moving through space, they would have detected it through their vast network of sensors. The fact that they had detected nothing meant there was nothing to detect. Humanity, they suggested, was simply misinterpreting data they were too primitive to understand properly. Speaker after speaker had risen to dismiss Earth's warning. The Amphithi, who lived in the gas clouds of nebulae. The Korthax, whose consciousness existed partially in other dimensions. The unified harmonics, who had been exploring space for 5 million years. Every ancient civilization in the assembly had looked at humanity's data and found it lacking. The consensus was clear. The humans were wrong. But it was High Chancellor Torvin who delivered the most cutting dismissal. Young species always see threats everywhere, he had said. When you only live for 100 years, every shadow looks like death. You have not learned patience. You have not learned to distinguish real danger from your own fear. Go home, humans. Study longer, learn more, and perhaps in another 1,000 years, you will be ready to contribute meaningfully to this assembly's discussions. The hologram showed Sarah Chen gathering her materials. Her face carefully neutral as laughter rippled through the chamber. She had walked out with her head high, but Elizabeth knew from family stories that her grandmother had wept that night. Not from humiliation, but from the terrible knowledge of what was coming. Elizabeth's voice hardened as she continued. My grandmother returned to Earth that day carrying the weight of the galaxy's dismissal. She met with Earth leadership in an emergency session. They sat in a reinforced bunker deep beneath the planet's surface, the same bunker built during humanity's last global war before we learned to unite. The question before them was simple: what do we do now? The debate had lasted for 3 days. Some argued that Earth should present the evidence again and find new ways to make the assembly listen. Others suggested that humanity should focus on evacuating key populations, preparing colony ships to flee beyond the galaxy if necessary. But it was General Catherine Morrison who proposed the plan that would define humanity's future. We prepare for war. She had said, we have 60 years, maybe 70 before this threat reaches inhabited space. That is enough time. We build weapons. We develop new technologies. We create defenses that no one has ever seen before. And we do it quietly. The plan was audacious and dangerous. The Galactic Assembly had strict regulations about military buildup. If humanity was caught secretly militarizing, they could be sanctioned, isolated, or even forcibly disarmed. But President James Torres had made the decision that saved humanity. We warned them, he said. We gave them the truth. If they choose to ignore it, that is their failing, not ours. We will protect our own people. And we will be ready when the darkness comes. Earth began the longest covert operation in human history. On the surface, humanity continued to play the role expected of them. They traded with other species, attended assembly sessions, and slowly expanded their territory into unclaimed systems. Human diplomats smiled and nodded, accepting their position as the junior members of galactic civilization. But beneath the surface, humanity was transforming itself into something new. In asteroid belts and empty star systems, hidden shipyards began construction on vessels designed for total war. Human scientists worked on weapons that targeted quantum fields, disrupted subspace, and countered technologies that Earth had only recently learned existed. Every human colony became a potential fortress, with underground bunkers and hidden defense platforms. Humanity also reached out quietly to other species who might believe their warnings. The Kelthans were an insectoid species who had been dismissed by the Assembly for similar concerns centuries earlier. They controlled important trade routes but had no political power. When Earth approached them with evidence and an offer of alliance, the Kelthans agreed immediately. They had learned not to trust the ancient species either. The Emperor were next. They were aquatic engineers, brilliant at constructing structures in hostile environments. Their home system was near the galactic rim, and they had noticed the same anomalies that Marcus Webb had detected. The Assembly had ignored their reports too. When humanity offered them protection and partnership, the Emperor joined the secret alliance without hesitation. The Drift were the third species to join. They were nomads, survivors of a civilization that had been destroyed by forces they still did not understand. They lived in generation ships, never staying in one place for long. The ancient species saw them as primitives, refugees without purpose. But the Drift had learned to survive against impossible odds, and they recognized the same quality in humanity. Elizabeth's hologram showed the construction projects that had consumed 60 years of human effort. Massive defense stations taking shape in the void. Fleets of warships, each one carrying weapons that could tear through conventional shields. Research facilities where human and allied scientists pushed the boundaries of known physics. All of it hidden from the Assembly site through careful misdirection and strategic positioning. Every decade, Earth sent another delegation to the Assembly with updated warnings. Every decade, they were dismissed with the same condescension. The pattern became predictable. Human scientists would present new data showing the threat growing closer. The ancient species would find reasons to ignore it. High Chancellor Torvin would deliver another speech about humanity's fear and inexperience. And the Assembly would move on to more important matters. But 50 years after the first warning, something changed. A colony on the galactic rim simply disappeared. The Vorath had established a mining operation on a planet rich in rare elements. 15 million workers lived there, extracting materials that the Vorath Empire needed for their technology. One day, the colony stopped transmitting. The Vorath sent a ship to investigate. The ship found nothing. Not ruins, not bodies, not even debris. The planet was still there, but it had been stripped bare. The atmosphere was gone. The oceans had vanished. Every structure had been dismantled down to the molecular level. The planet was just a lifeless rock in space, and there was no trace of what had happened to the 15 million beings who had lived there. Elizabeth's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The Assembly called an emergency session. For the first time in my grandmother's life, they wanted to hear what humanity had to say. But it was too late. The entity had arrived, and the dying had begun. The hologram faded, leaving Elizabeth standing alone in a dim chamber. Around her, the 400 survivors sat in absolute silence. They knew what came next. They had lived through it. But hearing humanity's side of the story, understanding how many warnings had been ignored, brought a new weight to their survival. Elizabeth looked out at the representatives of fallen civilizations. "We warned you," she said quietly. "For 60 years, we begged you to listen. And when you finally wanted our help, the price had already been paid in blood." The first part of Earth's final message had been delivered. When darkness came, the emergency session of the Galactic Assembly had convened with unprecedented speed. For the first time in recorded history, every member species sent their highest-ranking officials. The chamber that had been half empty during humanity's warnings now overflowed with desperate representatives. High Chancellor Torvin of the Vorath Empire stood at the central podium, his 4 eyes darting between the assembled delegates. His golden scales, usually radiant with confidence, seemed dull in the harsh lighting. Elizabeth Chen's hologram continued its narration, showing the chaos of that session 50 years ago. "My grandmother was there," she said. Ambassador Sarah Chen sat in the human delegation section, watching the species who had mocked her now scrambling for answers. The Vorath presented their findings about the lost colony. The data was undeniable. Something had consumed an entire planet, stripping it of everything that made it capable of supporting life. The crystalline collective was the first to connect the disappearance to humanity's warnings. Their speaker, a being named Frequency, vibrated at tones that translated to profound distress. "We have reviewed the human data from 6 decades ago," Frequency announced. "The trajectory predictions align with the location of the lost colony. The phenomenon they detected has reached inhabited space. Panic spread through the chamber, like fire through dry grass." Representatives shouted questions, demanded answers, called for immediate action. But it was High Chancellor Torvin who finally restored order. His voice, magnified by the chamber's acoustics, cut through the chaos. We need solutions, not hysteria. The humans detected this threat first. Let them speak. All eyes turned to the human delegation. Ambassador Sarah Chun rose slowly, carrying a data tablet that contained 60 years of research, planning, and preparation. She walked to the podium with the measured steps of someone who had waited a lifetime for this moment. Elizabeth's voice narrated what happened next. My grandmother stood before the assembly and told them the truth. Earth had not been idle during the decades of dismissal. Humanity had built defenses, developed weapons, and formed alliances with species who had believed their warnings. She presented technical specifications for quantum disruption technology that could theoretically damage the entity. She showed them fleet compositions, defensive strategies, and evacuation protocols. The chamber erupted again, but this time with outrage rather than fear. The ancient species were not grateful for humanity's preparations. They were furious that a junior member had secretly militarized while ignoring assembly regulations. The Korthax representative accused Earth of warmongering. The Amphithite claimed humanity had violated trust. Even the unified Harmonics, usually the most diplomatic species, expressed concern about what they called humanity's paranoid overreach. Hi. Chancellor Torvin's response had been measured but cold. You prepared for war without informing the assembly, he said to Sarah. You violated protocols that have maintained galactic peace for millions of years. This is concerning. However, given the current crisis, we are willing to overlook these violations if Earth shares all military technology immediately. Elizabeth's hologram showed her grandmother's face at that moment. Sarah Chen had looked at Torvin with an expression of profound sadness mixed with steel. She responded with words that would be remembered for generations. No, she had said simply. The single word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Torvin's scales had flushed with anger. You refuse to help? Sarah had shaken her head. We refuse to give away the results of 60 years of work to civilizations who called us children and fools. Earth will help defend the galaxy, but on our terms. The Assembly must acknowledge that our warnings were correct. You must restructure leadership to ensure junior species have equal voices. And you must commit to sharing resources and authority in the war effort. The vote was called within the hour. The measure to accept humanity's terms failed by a margin of 300 votes to 100. The ancient species would not accept equal partnership with humans. They would not acknowledge their mistakes publicly. They would not share power with the species. They still considered inferior despite everything that had happened. Ambassador. Sarah Chen had gathered her materials and prepared to leave. As she walked toward the exit, High Chancellor Torvin called out to her, What will humanity do now? Sarah had paused at the doorway. She looked back at the chamber full of ancient beings who had just chosen pride over survival. Earth will close its borders, she said. We will protect our people and our allies. When you are ready to treat us as equals rather than supplicants, you know where to find us? Elizabeth's narration continued as the hologram shifted to show the aftermath. Within days, human space became a fortress. The borders were sealed by fleets that appeared seemingly from nowhere. Trade stopped. Communication ceased. The defensive perimeter that humanity had been building in secret was suddenly visible to everyone, and its scale shocked the galaxy. Earth had constructed defensive stations at every major approach to human territory. Each station was armed with weapons that operated on principles the ancient species had never seen. Quantum disruption cannons that could tear apart the molecular bonds holding matter together. Subspace mines that would detonate in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Shield networks that operated outside normal space, making them immune to conventional attacks. The three allied species, the Kelthans, Amphora, and Drift, had joined humanity within the defensive perimeter. Their combined territory created a sphere of protected space encompassing 200 star systems. It was not large by galactic standards, but it was defended with a paranoia and thoroughness that only species who expected the worst could achieve. The Galactic Assembly sent delegations to negotiate. They were turned away at the border. They sent threats. The threats were ignored. They sent spies. The spies disappeared into the security networks that humanity and its allies had spent decades perfecting. The ancient species learned a hard lesson when humans decided to lock their doors. Those doors stayed locked. Meanwhile, the entity continued its advance. The hologram showed star chart after star chart going dark. The Vorith Empire, which had ruled for 3 million years, lost system after system. High Chancellor Torvin led desperate defense efforts, but Vorath weapons were designed for conventional warfare. They could destroy planets and shatter moons, but they could not fight an enemy that existed partially outside normal space, the crystalline. Collective tried to understand the entity through their quantum networks. They discovered that it was not a single being, but a distributed intelligence composed of trillions of microscopic components. Each component could manipulate matter at the atomic level, breaking down everything it touched and using the release energy to create more components. The entity was a self-replicating swarm that had been consuming galaxies for longer than any civilization had existed. Understanding the enemy did not help the crystalline collective survive it. Their homeworld, a massive crystal structure that had grown for millions of years, was consumed in 17 hours. The beings who had dismissed humanity's warnings simply ceased to exist. Their quantum networks dissolved into basic particles. Elizabeth's voice grew heavy as she described the fall as civilization after civilization. The Korthax, who existed partially in other dimensions, found that the entity could follow them between realities. The Empathes gas cloud cities were stripped of every molecule. The unified harmonics, despite their 5 million years of experience, had no answer to an enemy that did not negotiate, did not pause, and could not be reasoned with. 18 months after the first colony disappeared, 60% of inhabited space had been consumed. Trillions of beings had died. Civilizations that had stood for epochs crumbled in weeks. The Galactic Assembly, which had once governed hundreds of species, collapsed into chaos as members fled or were destroyed. The refugees began arriving at humanity's borders. They came in ships of every design, carrying the last survivors of worlds that had existed for millions of years. Crystal vessels holding the final crystalline fragments. Golden Vorith warships now filled with civilians rather than warriors. Ancient colony ships from species whose names humanity had barely learned. Commander Elizabeth Chen had been a junior officer then, commanding a patrol ship at the defensive perimeter. The hologram showed her younger self standing on the bridge, watching the refugee fleet approach. There were tens of thousands of ships, and behind them, the dark wave of the entity's advance was visible on long-range sensors. Orders came down from Earth Command. The refugees would be allowed through, but only under specific conditions. All weapons must be surrendered. All vessels must submit to human authority. All survivors must integrate into the defensive system under human command structure. There would be no exceptions, no special treatment for ancient species or former empires. Most refugees accepted immediately. They had seen what the entity did to those who refused to adapt. They surrendered their weapons, accepted human authority, and passed through the defensive perimeter into protected space. Humanity and its allies worked around the clock to process the flood of survivors, assigning them to temporary settlements on fortress worlds deep within human territory. But some refugees refused. A Vorith fleet of 30 warships arrived at the border, with High Chancellor Torvin himself commanding the lead vessel. He demanded entry as equals, not as refugees under human authority. Elizabeth's patrol ship had been the one to intercept them. The hologram showed the communication between Elizabeth and Torvin. The Vorith Chancellor's face filled the screen, his scales now dull gray with exhaustion and grief. "We will not surrender our weapons," he had declared. "The Vorith have never bowed to another species." Elizabeth had responded with words her grandmother had taught her. "Then you cannot enter. Our defensive system requires absolute coordination. We cannot have armed vessels operating outside our command structure." Torvin's 4 eyes had burned with fury. "You would let us die rather than accept us allies?" "We would let you choose," Elizabeth replied. "Pride or survival?" The decision is yours. For 3 days, the Vorath fleet had remained at the border. Behind them, the entity advanced. Torvin could watch his empire dying on his sensors while humanity's defensive line remained closed. On the 4th day, he made his choice. The Vorath surrendered their weapons. High Chancellor Torvin, ruler of an empire that had spanned thousands of worlds, accepted human authority. His fleet passed through the defensive perimeter, and the beings who had dismissed humanity for decades became refugees living under human protection. Elizabeth. Hologram showed the transformation of human space over the following months. 15 billion refugees from over 100 species now lived within the defensive perimeter. Humans, Kelthans, Amphora, and Drift worked alongside survivors from ancient civilizations. Building new colonies and organizing defensive positions, the entity reached humanity's borders. Exactly when Earth's predictions had said it would. The hologram displayed the first contact between human forces and the swarm. The microscopic components that made up the entity crashed against humanity's quantum disruption fields like waves against a breakwater. For the first time since the entity had begun its advance, it encountered resistance it could not simply overwhelm. Human weapons were specifically designed to counter the entity's capabilities. Quantum disruption cannons fired pulses that severed the connections between individual components, causing them to collapse into inert matter. Subspace mines detonated in cascading patterns that disrupted the entity's ability to coordinate across vast distances. Shield networks operated on frequencies that the entity's components could not penetrate or manipulate. The battle lasted for 6 months. Wave after wave of the entity crashed against human defenses. The ancient species, watching from their refugee settlements, saw humanity fight with a determination they had never imagined possible. Human crews worked in continuous shifts, never resting, never giving up. When ships were damaged, they were repaired and returned to the line. When positions were threatened, reinforcements arrived within hours, but the entity was adapting. Its trillions of components were learning from each engagement, developing new approaches to human defenses. Elizabeth's forces detected the change 3 weeks before the entity launched its largest assault. The swarm was concentrating its forces at 7 points along the defensive perimeter. Preparing to break through by sheer overwhelming force, Commander Elizabeth Cheen called a council of war. Representatives from every surviving species attended, meeting in a chamber that had been built for human military planning but now held beings of 100 different forms. Elizabeth stood before them and presented the situation without softening. Truth. The entity is preparing a massive assault across our entire defensive line, she said. Our projections show they will breach at least 3, possibly 4 positions. If they break through, everything inside the perimeter will be lost. The chamber fell silent. Every being present understood what that meant. The protected worlds holding billions of refugees would be consumed. The last remnants of galactic civilization would end. What can we do? Asked Frequency, the crystalline collective's last surviving speaker. Elizabeth looked at the assembled survivors. We fight. We hold the line. And if we cannot hold it, we make them pay for every inch they take. Former High Chancellor Torvin rose from his seat. His golden scales had regained some of their luster during his time in human space. What do you need from us? Elizabeth's response was simple. Everything. We need every species contributing according to their abilities. Vorath tactical expertise. Crystalline computational power. Kelthan industrial capacity. Amphren engineering. Everyone fights, or we all die together. The vote was unanimous. For the first time in galactic history, every surviving species united under a single command structure. The ancient species who had ruled the galaxy for millions of years now took orders from humans barely a century old. Pride no longer mattered. Only survival remained. The entity's assault came 3 weeks later. The hologram showed the battle from multiple perspectives. 7 massive concentrations of the swarm struck human defensive positions simultaneously. The scale of the attack defied comprehension. Trillions upon trillions of microscopic machines, working in perfect coordination, crashed against humanity's defenses, like a tsunami of living darkness. 4 positions held. The weapons humanity had spent 60 years developing, combined with the expertise of allied species, created barriers the entity could not break. But at 3 positions, the swarm broke through. Billions of components poured through the gaps, heading toward the populated worlds behind the defensive line. Admiral Marcus Chen, Elizabeth's brother, commanded the reserve fleet. He had been holding his forces back for exactly this scenario. As the entity broke through, he gave an order that no one had expected. All ships, prepare for ramming speed. The hologram showed the human reserve fleet accelerating toward the largest breach. At their head was the dreadnought Eternal Vigil, flagship of humanity's navy. The massive vessel, built over 40 years in secret shipyards, had been designed as a mobile fortress. Now it became a missile aimed at the heart of the swarm. Human ships were not elegant. They were not beautiful. They were built with one principle in mind: survive and keep fighting. Their hulls were layered with armor designed to absorb and distribute impact force. Their reactor cores could overload in controlled bursts, releasing massive amounts of energy. They were built as humans built everything. To endure, the Eternal Vigil struck the center of the swarm formation at near light speed. The impact was visible from light years away. A flower of fire bloomed in the darkness, and when it faded, 47 million entity components had been destroyed. The explosion disrupted the swarm's coordination network across the entire sector. For 3 critical minutes, the entity could not organize its attack. Other human ships followed. One by one, they drove into the swarm, sacrificing themselves to create gaps in the enemy formation. Each impact bought time for the defensive line to reorganize, for weapons to recharge, for reinforcements to arrive. Comments for next part.